Begin our panels. On track 1, we'll have the panel Challenges and Opportunities for Subnational Entities. Moderator will be Carlos Nascimento, Director of Programs and General Coordinator for LSE Custom Programs and the MBA PPP and Concessions. On track 2, we'll have the panel Partnership for the Planet, PPPs in Environmental Management. Moderator will be Ricardo Silva, Senior Expert in Operations, Concessions, and PPPs for the IDB. And on track 3, we'll have the panel PPPs and Digital Infrastructure, Improving the Connectivity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Moderator will be Gonzalo Arauz, Lead Investment Officer in Telecom, Media, and Technology for IDB Invest. Excellent panels, and you may begin.
Maybe it's worthwhile to ask each one of the panelists to tell us a bit or introduce themselves and tell us their experience in the sector. Guillermo, I think I interrupted you. Please go ahead. No, don't worry. My name is Guillermo Alarcón. I'm telecommunication IDB expert. I work in the sector that I'm very fond of, and I'm working in 3 continents and in many countries. And now here in the IDB supporting initiatives like this one with private-public partnerships. Tania, can you please introduce yourself briefly? Hello, how are you? My name is Tania Villa, and I worked in the technical regulatory analysis within the Mexican Telecommunications Institute that regulates this sector. And I have collaborated in different projects that have to do with PPPs, and I hope I can share my experience in this area. Excellent, thank you very much. Arieh, please, last but not least. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been more than 20 years in GILAT implementing projects in Peru based on PPPs in the telecommunications sector. I hope we can have a good conversation about the subject. Good, and the first point that I would like to discuss with all of you 3, what can the PPPs give to the future of digital infrastructure in the Latin America and the Caribbean? Tania, I would like to know your vision about PPPs and what will these partnerships, what role these partnerships will play in the future. Thank you, Gonzalo. Well, to begin with, I can say that in Mexico, 2 of the 3 major connectivity projects have to do with PPP projects. On the one hand, the current government has the project to take the internet to the entire country, which is called, a program is called Internet for All, and we're working with PPPs. On the other hand, we also have the 700 megahertz bandwidth transmission, which is also a PPP. And in this scenario, we also want to say that, talk a bit about the Mexican context. Mexico is a country which mobile internet services reach 86% of the population. But that doesn't mean necessarily that 96% of the population pays for the use of this service, either because it does not have a device to connect themselves or due to the costs of the service. In this setting, the PPPs gives us the opportunity to take services to regions where we do not have connectivity, or maybe where there is connectivity, but it's not affordable for the population. And in this scenario, I'd like to mention 2 examples in which PPPs projects have contributed to enhance connectivity in the country. In the north of the country, there is a state called Zacatecas. In this state, which is characterized by, because Mexico is very diverse geographically speaking. And in these northern states, we have mountains, we have deserts, so it's not very easy for the traditional operators to take telecommunications infrastructures. And in this state, there's an association of wireless internet providers have established cooperation agreements with city authorities. So they offer free internet services in schools, and the cities give them permits and facilities to deploy their infrastructure. So in these rural areas where there is no telecommunications infrastructure, we can have free access to the internet. This type of initiatives work very well to take connectivity to remote areas or hard-to-reach areas or areas that are not appealing for traditional operators. This is just an example. And on the other hand, we have a special case that I would like to explain to you. There are other examples, like a city called San Miguel de Allende. This is a city in the middle of the country, which is characterized by being one of the main touristic destinies of Mexico, and it is cataloged by UNESCO as a cultural patrimony of the country. Here it's prohibited to deploy telecommunication infrastructures, and downtown, no, it's very visited, but did not have internet services. And in addition, it's very hard to reach. In this context, the city began a PPP with a private company that is dedicated to disseminate telecommunication infrastructure, so that this private company would set cables to the entire downtown and entire city, and to install radio bases, both in some buildings and downtown, but with the condition that they would not have an impact on the environment and the architecture of the region would be respected. So the company made the investment to deploy the infrastructure, and the city gave them this permit to deploy and commercialize the infrastructure with other operators. One is the cabling of the entire historical downtown, so then the private company could commercialize these services with other providers. And now they could also connect with some cables and have internet services in their own offices, because they did not have good internet services. Once that the entire zone was connected, this allowed the city to connect to intelligent devices and provide free internet for public transportation. So this city of San Miguel de Allende made the transition by being a city with having low in connectivity to an intelligent city. So in this way, we can see that our PPPs examples in different settings, that is to take connectivity to rural areas that are not very profitable, but also connect regions that are highly profitable, but for other reasons did not have the service. In these examples that I was sharing, we can see how the PPPs offer benefits, mutual benefits, not only in the services that they can offer to the cities, but also the services that the cities themselves can offer to the population. And in this way, I think that the PPPs are very relevant, especially in Latin American and Caribbean countries, because I think we share similar features. We normally have this geographical diversity where the terrain makes it difficult to have access to telecommunication infrastructures, and we have areas that are very profitable. And as I said, which is something very relevant, that including regions or zones where, or areas where we have high profitability and many potential users, these PPPs can be very relevant. Thank you very much, Tania. Very interesting, the experiences. And now I would like to hear or see the point of view of the private operators. These are the PPPs a good business? How is it in Peru? How do PPPs connect to your business models? Well, thank you very much. As Tania mentioned, there are many infrastructure gaps in Peru and in Latin America overall. And I think that the PPPs are an essential tool to direct this investment, to channel this investments that the private sectors does not do independently because they are not profitable, especially in the more rural, remote areas, to be able to increase their coverage and reach the more needy people. Or because they don't take them due to the difficulty to get the licenses. And in Peru, I think that undoubtedly public investments is necessary to take telecommunications infrastructure to the rural areas, and the PPP's model is essential due to the experience that the operators have to operate and build the infrastructure, and the state be able to channel investments to remote areas or areas with demand, unmet demand. So we can talk about some successes in designing these projects. It allows to take the infrastructure and offer services to public agencies. And thanks to these projects, many schools, hospitals, and police stations today have coverage and internet services. I think there's nothing better than a remote school. See children studying there, connecting to internet, and going to Google and having access to educational material. It's something that did not occur before the investment in this type of service. So I think that this subsidy was to give the service specifically to the institutions, the government institutions that require, is much more efficient than the part of taking the infrastructure per se. And the thing is, I think that the telecommunication operators take the infrastructure or the capacities to the profitable regions or areas, but then depending of the time until the state decides where to take the infrastructure, where they want to invest to take telecommunications, until we have the plan and it's implemented, many times we have overpositioning of networks. We have the state with their own networks with the networks of the operators, and that creates conflict because that takes away clients to the subsidized networks.
If you need to connect thousands of schools nationally, you need to do it as efficiently as possible and figuring out what the best way to get the technology to those cities is. Often it's more efficient to get the carriers to find the more efficient solutions for each school that they want to connect. And as long as you have the proper incentives in place, whether it's the carrot or the stick, you'll be able to get efficient and successful investment. So I think that the model per se is certainly appropriate for expanding coverage and expanding. I think it's also an excellent grant. It's an excellent basis for setting up grants. I think the next step after setting up the infrastructure and ensuring connectivity, the government needs to focus on infrastructure services or based on the infrastructure. For example, teleeducation, telehealth, based on the well-established infrastructure, or somehow being closer to the population, allowing them to submit documents faster, get through the bureaucracy faster, get through the red tape. Just better access to government services in general. I think even perhaps digital banking, online banking. I think that if we had a digital platform for finance for banks, I think you could avoid 90% of the money that's spent on transporting money to the different branches of the banks, etc. So I think the next important step is going to be these types of services based on the infrastructure that's already there. I think your point of view is very interesting, and your experience in Peru is quite impressive. I'd also like to talk about some of the challenges in these new business models. Guillermo, it's not easy. What are the resources and funds available to support these types of government initiatives? PPPs offer a wide spectrum of opportunities, as my colleagues have already mentioned. Direct grants to government-backed companies, all the way up to whatever. There's so many possibilities. There is an inherent flexibility and a number of solutions as under the PPP umbrella, and I've seen this over my career. So for the government sector, we can have better policies and regulations for this sector. And those policies can support nationally and regionally, and we can adapt to the different circumstances to make sure that we have got a better basis in place to support these PPPs. And that is a way to support the dynamic nature of our sector. This also requires balancing two things. One is fiscal or tax predictability with the flexibility that will encourage innovation and experimentation and entrepreneurship in general. And this balancing act is not easy. At the IDB, we recently published a proposal that we call the Rio 5G. And this is based on renewing spectrum licenses and creating spectrum markets that they've had in the law, legalized in Brazil. And basically what we're trying to do is to have certainty on one hand and innovation on the other hand. Rio 5G is not just the only solution out there, but it's a way to establish regulatory resources that allow for us to balance out the tax and investment certainty on one hand and this need for innovation and experimentation on the other. What we did is we realized of the importance of having impartial, trustworthy, periodic, precise data to be able to map out demand, as Javier mentioned. With this data, we can better design project law and legislation and policy, in fact. There was a Brazil connectivity project, in fact, and for that we mapped out the demand for unmet demand or unmet demand throughout the country. So satellite data, outsourcing data, on-the-ground data are absolutely fundamental resources to to add to these government requirements that you were talking about, health care and traffic lights and schools, etc. And that brings me to my third point, not just government regulation and policy, but developing better policies. Because when we collect this data, we've got to understand the dynamics and hopefully use that data to predict. And we should be using better data analytics. If we use the tools at our disposal now, we'll be able to offer both this certainty and the flexibility to design an operation of these PPPs. And that will allow us, will help a world that is increasingly more dynamic and requires these connections increasingly more. Thank you so much. Excellent. Going back to Arieh, given your experience, and Guillermo mentioned a few of these, what is important for a successful PPP? Guillermo mentioned this already. The real basis is that there is, for success and for companies to get involved in a project, large companies to get involved in projects, and to jump into telecom and infrastructure projects, is that you need legal stability, you need transparency with the government-backed companies. It's quite difficult to quantify this and the importance of this. When we look at large projects or implementations, if it's not clear what the problems are, where the technical issues are, and what you need to balance out the public and the private, you won't go anywhere. So this stability is the basis for getting large companies excited about going in and supporting these large infrastructure projects and large infrastructure PPPs. For this basis, you need to work in a way that is coordinated so that both public and private interests pursue a common interest. They bring more people in and meet the needs of a population that has thus far been ignored. Everyone looks at their partner in this public-private partnership, and if they only look at this profitability and they ignore quality, they ignore the other elements like access, broad universal access. If we don't look for those bigger pictures, it's not gonna be successful. Again, if the government is only looking at the legal aspect and doesn't look at the conditions where these projects are being implemented or the difficulties or the social conflicts that this might generate and doesn't look to solve them and address them, it's not going to be successful. So we need a lot of coordination between all parties involved. And you want, with this project, to improve services for a greater slice of the population, better access to the population, to the internet, smart traffic lights. You've got not just better traffic, but that you can have cameras, but you can also improve traffic flow, and you can improve your travel time or your time it takes to get to work. Or perhaps saving lives because the flow is so much better that the ambulances get where they need to get there. So, or in the face of any disaster, all of this is what makes up good communication. It's not just access per se. It's improving services for the people, expanding services to the greater population, and the only way to do that is to have a joint effort. Guillermo mentioned this. On one hand, you need to have the studies, you need to understand these gaps from the get-go. But there's another side to it. But I think the other thing is to encourage the companies that offer the most innovative solutions. Let them be the ones offering the services. I think I have a good example for you. The first project that GILAT participated in Peru, 20 years, was the distance that people had to walk to a public telephone. That was it. GILAT was the first company to come with a satellite-based solution for this. And the grant that it asked for was like 10% of the next company. Because we looked for certain rates, we looked for voice quality, we were focused on the right areas. So establishing these elements, and we were able to establish broad enough elements to allow for a disruptive technology throughout the country. It made it much more efficient and be able to bring this service to many more areas than otherwise we would have, or other companies were offering. So understand what the service is that's required and do it in such a way that's broad enough so that a new technology that may not be that those who are bidding on the project, that those who are presenting the project aren't even familiar with. And with this technology, allow to bring in new technologies, to do disruptive technologies that offer, again, greater efficiency, greater speed, greater coverage with less government investment. That is the solution. That's the equation. Thank you so much. Excellent comments. I wanted to hear from Tania. What have been the greatest challenges that you faced in designing these PPPs? Thank you so much. As I see it, and I'm talking from the perspective of Mexico, one of the biggest challenges is often offering legal stability and certainty to the private companies. Local regulation is often doesn't match up with federal regulations. And this, I think, happens in other regions, other countries in the region. Sometimes the permits for infrastructure, the permits are given by the municipalities or the cities, and that's a very local-based legal structure. So federally speaking, there's a problem where there's this kind of back and forth. So there's a problem when the local government doesn't offer these permits, doesn't give the permit, or I don't know how much red tape that has to be jumped through in order to get it, and you have to keep going back to the window and get this, that, and the other. This frustrates the private company, which is the company that needs to invest to carry out these projects, to deploy these projects. A few weeks ago, a number of recommendations were issued for the cities in Mexico. They realized that there wasn't enough competition in these areas. And when there isn't more than one offer and there isn't competition, it's quite difficult to get all of the permits, to get through all the red tape, to offer new infrastructure or new services. So these recommendations, they were just published, but nonetheless, they're still recommendations, and they will depend on whether the cities will take them to heart or not. Because the problem is, federally, at the federal level, they cannot force the state or city level to accept these recommendations and or to issue certain permits. One recommendation, for example, was that the cities establish a single area where the private companies could go and get all of the permits done and all of the paperwork done. And the other recommendation was that they facilitate these permits. So because of this bureaucracy, we often see a lack of offers in these bids, and this is what leads to a lack of competition when it comes to prices. Now, it's not a question of whether the PPPs work or don't work. I think there's ample evidence that they actually do work. The real question is what is the most efficient way to implement these PPPs, and what are the metrics that will allow us to determine whether a PPP is successful or not? I personally think that we need to find success cases that can be used as examples, and we can understand them from a number of different perspectives. Political, economically, socially, technologically, and legally speaking, they need to be airtight. What are the benefits of these PPPs? What is required to implement them? The population, when has more connectivity and better internet, we've clearly seen that this socially is beneficial to the population. We saw this during the pandemic in Mexico. When we asked everyone to stay at home, we saw a extensive collaboration with these carriers, and so they offered better service to the entire country. We also saw a lot of initiatives, an initiative called Learn from Home, where there are a lot of children who couldn't go to school, and they might have had internet before the pandemic, but it really wasn't good internet. They didn't have it cabled at home, and the cell phone, and they were paying for their data streaming services. And obviously, requires a lot of data. So we had this initiative so that all data that corresponded to learning were made free. All of the radio operators, all the telephone carriers, they basically made these data free. So there were certain specific channels that were simply opened up and anyone could access freely because they were related to education. And we saw that this had a very positive impact on the population. Of course, this requires that we require data and metrics to analyze this and to better understand this digital transformation of society in general. So these are just a few examples. And looking again at connectivity, that's not going to unilaterally be solved by public companies, private companies, the government. Just like Arieh mentioned, it's going to be a concerted effort. PPP initiatives it needs to come from the private sector, but it needs to be a joint effort. I think the private sector that needs to head these initiatives. They better understand the local problems. And in fact, in Mexico, we have a few regions where uses and customs are affected. We have some indigenous regions where the same population, it's the population itself that doesn't want this infrastructure. So these initiatives, these community initiatives, also need to be reviewed. So and we have to respect their customs. So if we look at all of these elements and take them into consideration, we see how important it is to have this how we can have a collaboration that looks at the benefits that every single party can gain by this partnership. I think we need a monitoring element to these PPPs, especially to look at these differences. And these monitoring groups can help bring these PPPs to other regions in the country or to other countries. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for the wonderful comments. I think the digital investments in our country are immense, and we need a lot of resources, a lot of funds to be able to carry this out. But there's a lot of will to cooperate. There's a lot of clamor for these PPPs. And it's clear that implementation is not easy. There are a lot of factors and there are a lot of elements both from the public side and the private side, and you've given great examples here. And the availability of to have good information and to be able to use this information is critical, but it'll help us. What we need to do is bring our work together so that we focus on a common objective in the region so that we have a better connected, more engaged region. Thank you so much, and stay tuned.